Could you expound on that some?
Sure. If you could picture a triangle and think of the top point of that triangle being theological and perhaps the lower left-hand corner being philosophical or that academic side you're looking at. But then that third part is missional. So when you deal with apologetics, there is something that you have to learn about theology. There's something you have to learn about philosophy. And unfortunately today, most of what you hear about apologetics comes from the philosophical point. And that's where it gets into that whole academic thing. And of course, philosophy requires its own language and understanding. But that missional part is really the part that I think helps the church. And what we need to do is get at least a cursory understanding of the theological implications, like the moral law would come under theology, I believe, because it deals with the nature of God, where perhaps you have some of the philosophical arguments for the existence of God and God's design and purpose really comes under that philosophy part. But now, how do you translate that into the missional part, that the average believer learns something about the theological aspect and even the philosophical aspect and is able to take that into the world, to the water cooler, to the lunch table, to the bus ride, the train ride, in the office wherever they are free to have discussions, or the housewife who has a play date with a neighboring woman and gets into a discussion about life and everything. How do they translate that? And the reason why I think you need to learn these things is because of the kind of culture that we live in today is no longer just monolithic. In other words, it's not just a Christian-supported worldview, but we live in a pluralistic world. As I mentioned in elsewhere, that you have a Darwinian view of life. You could have a New Age view of life. You can have a Buddhist view of life. And not to mention whether you are dealing with someone who's a Mormon, a Jehovah's Witness, or someone who's a part of some other cult. It's just so important for you to know how to interact and engage with that person and learn the questions to ask that'll really bring what they believe to the surface so that you can now deal with that. You can now interact with them at that level. I think that's where apologetics really is so important in the church today. Most Christians do not witness. They do not share their faith out of fear. They're afraid to get into a conversation where they're going to look ignorant. They're not going to know an answer. They're not going to know how to respond to this person. And apologetics really is where you learn all those things on how to deal with this. And it's something that I always call heavy lifting. It requires some work. It requires some study. It requires some practice. And it's not that you have to become a theologian or a philosopher, but you do have to share your faith. That is something that we're all required to do. So it really is helpful in us learning how to share our faith in a pluralistic society and in a culture that in many ways is anti-Christian.